I think it's probably obvious by now that all day what we're really talking about is that small task of saving the world. Our next two speakers have really skin in the game on this one. Tanya Steele, in green, leads the UK office of the Worldwide Fund for Nature. This is the planet's largest independent conservation organisation. She also happens to be its first female chief executive. WWF have recently published the landmark People's Plan for Nature. Now, this sets out the public vision, the vision of people like you sitting in this room today for the future of nature in the UK, and the actions that we really do need to take to protect and renew it. And it just so happens we have someone from the Assembly as well. Charlie Beattie is a 17-year-old student and the youngest member involved in the People's Assembly for Nature. Charlie is a true political activist attending protests regarding climate change and queer youth rights. Please welcome them both. Tanya, will you start off by explaining to us how the idea came about and how you executed the People's Plan for Nature?
Well, it came very much, I know some people will have seen earlier Hilary, who shared some insights into the Wild Isles series. This is a landmark television series that ourselves and RSPB co-produced with the BBC. And we knew, just seeing the content, that it would actually start to set a conversation underway in the UK, because what our research and our polling had found us is that people had actually been really shocked to find out that the UK isn't necessarily this green and pleasant land. It's one of the most nature-depleted countries on the planet. And what our polling also tells us is actually, as citizens, we all feel pretty overwhelmed and we don't know what we're going to do. So we kicked off a national conversation. We asked 3 very simple questions, and we were pretty amazed by the volume of responses. We had 30,000 responses. And that set really us the course to establish a world first in creating a nature assembly, which we were hoping the participants, 103 participants from all 4 devolved nations, would hopefully set about thinking about what a people's plan for nature could be.
Charlie, you were one of them.
Yes.
You were the youngest. Mum also applied and didn't get on, did she?
Yes, that's true.
Okay. Did you know what you were letting yourself in for? Why was it something that appealed to you?
I attended a lot of climate change protests from quite a young age, and in general, I was kind of always raised by the idea that the world needed saving, and there's always something going on. And the Assembly really spoke to me because I had no idea the severe depletion of nature in the UK. I had no idea how bad any of it was. So to be involved in something that could potentially fix that was really intriguing.
How did you choose your panel?
It was entirely randomly chosen. This is where we worked with some real experts to do that. And it was a random selection process that ultimately, in the end, brought forward, I think it was in the end, it was about 107 participants, but 103 kind of went through the full course. I was joking with a dear Guardian journalist who was on the panel, and she went saying she expected it to be full of lots of other eco-activists. She couldn't have been more surprised in terms of the breadth of people, of age groups, of socio-economic backgrounds. But it was actually about people who were curious and really interested, I think, to join in the 4 weekends of learning with academics, with farmers, with businessmen, with economists, to actually help them lay out the problems and then invite them to offer up some solutions.
Charlie, tell us a bit about the experience then. We heard about the 4 weekends, the 103 people who saw it through to the end. What did you actually do? How did it work?
So for the first assembly, we had an icebreaker night on the first night. We had dinner together, got to know each other, and pretty much from then on, we went straight into it. We had speakers, a couple every single day. We were separated into randomized tables, and we just kind of listened to what everybody had to say. And then at the end of a speaker's turn, we would get together as a group and figure out what in that speaking was so important, how is this relevant to us, and how does this relate to nature in the UK in general?
And then how easy was it to get consensus? I mean, talking as Tanya said about such a wide range, I mean, curious is one thing. You're clearly really invested. Did you find it frustrating at times?
Very. Everybody had a lot of different opinions, especially during the first few weekends when everyone was still kind of getting to grips with the idea that everything is as terrible as you think it is. I think that what kind of started to change people's minds was towards, I think during the second and third weekends, we kind of had more opinions to ourselves in that it wasn't so randomized, and we were able to choose which parts and which calls to action we were as invested in. So it became less of a, oh, I don't really care about this, and more, I'm currently sitting in a group of people who are really interested in what we're talking about and what part of the assembly this is.
Did you learn a lot?
Oh, yeah. I had no idea how bad everything was. And I think when we first entered the assembly, a lot of us were kind of under the impression that nothing we could do in our communities in general could really help, and that everything was relying on the government and what we could put forward in this assembly. But I think that one of the key things that everybody learned at the end was that we can actually make a difference ourselves. It's not just relying on them. Everybody has to make a change in order for the change to be done.
Yeah, I mean, that's a key message today that Andy Haldane, the CEO here at the RSA, is really keen for us all to talk about. We know there are problems, don't we? But that idea that there is hope, and when you're talking and storytelling, the storytelling idea comes out a lot. Do you feel that that's a little bit about what the People's Plan for Nature and the Assembly was about, was capturing some storytelling?
I think in some ways there's no doubt, and again I could only observe, you know, at a real distance. I was dying to engage and obviously not allowed to, but it was the stories that actually people honed in on. Participants were really keen to draw some conclusions and actually see some action. I mean, there were 26 recommendations, and I know Charlie has a copy of the plan here as well, and there is an awful lot of detail in there and an awful lot of consideration as well, and we're starting to see some progress as well on the discourse on nature. It's not just something to enjoy at the weekends. Actually, we're starting to, this has enabled us to really start a dialogue around economics, business, and indeed what society might do in order to take some of this action forward.
But it is really empowering, isn't it? We're going to talk to Rebecca Solnit later on, whose latest book is here on the table, and she's going to talk about Not Too Late. It's empowering to believe that as individuals, our opinions and what we want to change matters, that it isn't just the state or industry that has a say, or even just agriculture. Is that part of the story? Is this why you did this, in order to capture individual voices too?
Unquestionably. And I guess I'd say a couple of things. The third, I mentioned at the start we'd ask these three questions to kick off, if you like, a national conversation and get some feedback. The third question really honed in and asked people on examples they'd seen and experienced, actually where progress was being made, where nature had bounced back, and there were some incredible examples. So we can hone in on the doom and gloom, and there's no doubt, if we think about the climate and the nature crisis, we are at, you know, a minute to midnight, but it is still in our grasp to do something about it. And I think for citizens' agency within that, both in how we cast a vote, both in how we have expectations around business, our governance mechanisms, and the choices we make, I think that's really central to this.
It's really interesting to me that you can be part of that, but you can't vote yet in this country. Tiny bit of politics there for you. What are you most proud of in the Plan for Nature?
I think I'm most proud of the call to actions about education, because the unanimous decision towards the end of the assembly was that everybody sort of realized, I had no clue about any of this. I had no idea the severity of it. I had no idea just how bad things are. And I know that I've already said this, but it was truly unanimous among everybody. There wasn't a single person who left that assembly who didn't learn something new. And I think that it's really important that we spread that, because if we don't, then how can a change truly be made if we don't spread the education and spread that call to action specifically, in my opinion?
We put a lot of pressure on the younger generation because we keep talking about the fact that this is their planet, their future. Does that feel weighty on your shoulders and the shoulders? I thought it might. Yeah. How do we alleviate that? Because we're not too old to do it too.
I completely agree, and I think it's entirely wrong. I think we absolutely have to have this next generation firmly in our sights in terms of what role we might play, as opposed to being bystanders in protests, in concerns being raised. And I mean, in fairness, there are some things that we're starting to move forward on, and actually Charlie has played a very important role in this. We are seeing institutions step forward. Recently, the Food and Farming Commission and Countryside Commission committed to kick off a piece of work over the summer in terms of a national conversation on food. We've just, in the last 7 days, secured 2 amendments in the House of Lords, and Charlie was very much there meeting with parliamentarians, members of the Lords. Those were 2 very important, sounds terribly technical, but very, very important amendments. One was in terms of regulatory regime for oversight on nature, thinking about that, you know, the Bank of England as a regulator. The second was around due diligence, and that's about businesses carrying out due diligence before their supply chains or their actions actually are destroying what is effectively our national heritage as well. But we're also seeing businesses start to both understand the risk within their own operations, their ability to achieve their climate targets, whether it's net zero, and frankly, their employees saying, you know, we are really concerned about participating in the workplace if actually the work we do is driving this damage for the future as well. So we're seeing both the public move, but actually some of the mechanisms in the institutions start to move around us. The question is, how quickly can we move and how certain can we be that we can actually get some of these actions underway?
Where in particular, Tanya, would you most like to accelerate our ambition and our sense of urgency?
I think unquestionably on our food and farming system, and I know Henry Dimbleby just spoke and is a dear friend in that regard, but we have to look at the data. I mean, ultimately, 60% of our biodiversity, our nature, is lost due to the way in which we produce and consume food, and we're part of that as citizens. It's also responsible for 30% of human-made emissions as well. So we've kind of got the climate and the biodiversity dimension. But I think importantly, what we can't do is just blame farmers and food producers in this regard. We've all enjoyed quite cost-effective food over the years, but also it's the incentive system. So let's move the incentive system, and I know Partha Dasgupta will be speaking shortly as well. What is the incentive system that ensures that we produce healthy and sustainable food for the future, which also means we've got a healthy planet for future generations to live on as well?
Do you see that as the most urgent area as well, food and farming, from your work on the Assembly, Charlie, or would you look to another area?
I would agree that it is incredibly urgent, but I think that another part of the plan that is just as important is enforcing the government legislation, because without the government putting environment and nature at the heart of all current and even existing legislation, we can't fix the damage that has already been done. So I think that whilst food and farming is definitely a huge important part, I think that holding the government accountable and putting forward some of that legislation is also an extremely important part.
How did you find it going and lobbying? It sounds like you did, you know, with that work you were doing at the House of Lords and the amendments.
It was actually really interesting. I felt that the MPs and Lords who were there were interested in what we had to say. I think that they also had a little bit of their own biases towards what we were saying, but they were very, very open, and they were definitely receptive to what we had to say in regards to the government and legislation.
I'm interested because I mentioned at the beginning that you're a true campaigner and activist, even though you're only 17 years old. Do you think that there is something to take forward from the Assembly and the plan that is applicable to other areas of life in terms of capturing the public and the broad public sentiment and mood and appetite for change in other areas of our lives?
Well, this is still sort of related to nature, but one of the main parts of the People's Plan was establishing a citizens' assembly, and a permanent citizens' assembly based around nature and based around what the government can do to help. And I think that a citizens' assembly could actually be applicable to many ordinary life problems. The idea of talking to the people instead of just one or two people, having a variety and a different perspective from everybody can truly make a difference when it comes to actually changing whatever the problem is.
We're told we can vote, and that's how we can change things. But for some people, that's not quick enough at the moment, is it, Tanya?
Definitely not. We need some action now, and we can see too many gaps. But I think also, though, to build on Charlie's reflections, I I was pretty blown away by the quality of public policy making in action in that room. I mean, the quality of the debates, the discussions, and the way in which those issues were being weighed up. And I think there's something we can learn within what is, you know, the home of democracy, within a thriving democracy. How do we ensure that we have that kind of active public policy making that actually goes right the way through into our parliamentary system? And certainly on nature, we'd love to see that. But I think there's some lessons more generally.
You mentioned the Guardian journalist. I read her piece about the Assembly and the plan. She was quite aggrieved that by the end of the process, people were still ordering meat at the get-together meal. Do you think there is still a disconnect between what we say we want to see and what we're prepared to do as individuals?
I mean, there's no doubt it's human nature as well. But I'm a great believer that, I guess there's a couple of things. I think that there is a space for a very varied diet. We know that diet, in this case, is an example of adjustments we need to make. I'd also say that we do need to ensure that we have a whole range of structures that actually make some of these choices a lot easier, and I'm not sure those choices are so easy, whether that's the way in which they're priced, whether it's the availability in the supermarket, but also, sure, as citizens, we do need to respond to this a little bit as well.
Let's open this up to the floor. We've got roving microphones. If you've got a question about the People's Assembly, or indeed the plan, or indeed Tanya's wider work, then please do, yeah, absolutely, chap in the middle towards the back.
Thanks so much, that was really interesting. So throughout today, we've heard such amazing stories about young people, and all of our faith should be in young people. But it really feels to me like that is absolving responsibility. It is saying, you know, Maya said at the beginning of the day, most of these problems should have been solved before she was born. And we're almost saying now, okay, we can't do this, let's let young people do it. And then my fear is that then the response is, let's do lots of these participatory exercises where we have lots of great discussion, but nothing is actually done, and power isn't given away. And this, I think, is a more fundamental question over where does the power lie in this sector, in nature. Have you seen any really good examples of power being given to these citizens' assemblies? Have we seen good examples of people being able to have control over the nature debate that they are taking part in?
Thank you. It's a great question. I'll go on to Tanya with it. Did you feel powerful or empowered, Charlie, while you were part of the process?
I did. I think one of the most important parts of the Nature's Assembly itself is I understand the idea that this is just a plan. There hasn't actually been any action, or we have yet to see the action and results. But also, I'd like to remind everybody that this is very early days. It was only launched in March. We spoke to Parliament literally on Tuesday. There is stuff happening. I mean, even being here today is an example of being involved in the nature debate. And it doesn't seem like much, but at the end of the day, it's definitely better than nothing. And it's signs of a future where even more is happening, and it's going to go forward even more.
Thank you. Tanya, yeah, well done. Tanya, what's your assessment of a great question that boils down to, is enough power being given away here to the right people?
Absolutely. I mean, when I was very kindly invited to this event, I said I'd only attend if I could bring a member of the People's Assembly. Because ultimately, I think what Charlie and the other participants have to say is actually much more important than me at this point in time. So I completely agree. More broadly, I guess I'd answer your question in two ways. First of all, I think too much is being put on the citizen and actually the younger generation. I think Mayor Rose is exactly right. And it's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. The way in which power and financial flows work within any setting, particularly a democratic setting, is largely through our government, if you like, certainly our financial institutions and our businesses. And that's where we really have the opportunity to make changes. And I don't say that to catcall, I say that as an invitation, and there's no doubt that many of those institutions are moving and are listening. But ultimately, they are the duty bearers. They are the ones that are driving, in economics terms, the externalities, the damage and the loss that we're seeing. So we absolutely must invite, but we also must hold them to account to make that shift. In terms of where are we seeing some of these moves and changes, I think it's patchy, but there are definitely parts of the world where we are seeing some of these moves and changes, and unquestionably the legal system's been very helpful. I'll shortly be travelling to Brazil, to the northeastern parts of the Amazon, and seeing the role of indigenous communities realising their rights, reasserting their rights against a whole range of incursions, etc., in order to ensure that they own and steward, in this case, the land. There are definitely glimmers of that, but we have so much more to do.
We're going to come on to things like that, I think, with Rebecca later on, because as well as owning the power, you've got to own the story as well, haven't you, when it comes to climate? That was a great question. Thanks so much. Would anybody else like to ask a question? Yes?
I have a loud voice. What can we do to help? I mean, it's so inspiring, particularly someone not yet ready to vote who's done all this.
I think she's ready, she's just not allowed to.
I think we're ready for her, actually. I think we're really ready for her. But, how can we help?
I think one of the things that could be helpful is sending letters to your local MPs. We want to push this plan forward as much as possible. We want as many people to see it as possible. Talking to your local community, talking to your MP are great ways to just even have it in local circulation. And by doing that, you can further advance the message even more than you probably think you can.
Do you like to add to that, Tanya?
Firstly, to agree. So I'll do a website plug. Go on to saveourwildisles.org.uk. There's a series of sort of email actions or invitations to write to your MP. Again, the number of MPs I sit down with, and they do reflect and talk about what's in their mailbag. They care about it, they take note of it. So certainly if it has nothing on these issues, then they're obviously not necessarily going to spot it. Certainly, is there something you can do in your community? One of the things we launched as part of the series with Wild Isles, and more generally in terms of the action following the People's Plan for Nature, is a community fund. This is something that Aviva has very kindly co-funded with us, and for every £1 raised by a community group to rewild, to create outdoor space, they will match it to £2 extra on top. So there are absolutely things and steps that you can take personally. And I guess the final thing I'd say, particularly as members of the RSA, you hold more influence than most. You have incredible careers, incredible networks. Think about what opportunities you might have to influence, whether it's in your workplace, whether it's within your broader network, to actually download a film. We have a series of business films on this issue, or actually to consider your own impact on your own footprint.
What a great note on which to end. Holding you lot to account. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you both. Tanya and Charlie, thank you.